Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Don't we need a new strategy for ISIL? We are going. You've been talking about going to the House of Commons to get permission for bombing, and one of the reasons that MPs are not supporting the government at that, they say another 8 tornadoes on the back of everything Americans are going to do. It's not going to be a game changer. The former Vice Chief of the Defence Staff has said something very similar. This is not going to be a war-winning operation. And therefore MPs say, well, if there isn't a war-winning strategy, why are we doing it? Don't we need a war-winning strategy?
Well, clearly, we are part of a coalition of more than 60 nations, and a decision we make on its own isn't going to tip the balance in the campaign on the battlefield. To be successful against ISIL, we have to destroy ISIL in its heartland in eastern Syria. And to do that effectively, we have to get a political solution to the broader civil war in Syria. That process is now underway again with a meeting held in Vienna 10 days ago. We're having another meeting in Vienna next Saturday to take that process forward. We have to get a ceasefire on the battlefield. We have to get a political dialogue going that involves the legitimate opposition groups in Syria, so that we can get all people who believe in a future for Syria working together against the terrorists in ISIL.
This is really interesting, because I was talking to Sir Nick Horton, the CDS, and he thinks that this is a possible turning point in our relations with the Russians. They may look again at the transition from Assad in Syria, and this may be the moment when Putin ceases to be our great enemy and becomes, in some sense, an ally.
Well, on this particular issue, Syria and ISIL, we see eye to eye with the Russians on lots of things. With our vision for a future Syria is broadly similar.
Well, except for Assad, presumably.
Well, except for, I'll come to that. The need to destroy ISIL, the Russians completely agree with us. They've got a very large Muslim population in the Russian Federation. They are very alert to the risks of radicalization. The one thing we disagree on, frankly, is the future of Bashar al-Assad, where we and most of our allies and partners believe that he needs to go at a point in the transition process. And the Russians at the moment are still saying, no, he must be allowed to stand in a future election if he wishes to do so.
So we're talking about a transition at some point in the future anyway. It doesn't sound though we're that far apart on that issue even.
What would be perfect would be if Mr. Assad was to wake up one morning and decide he just didn't want to do this job anymore.
Wouldn't that be great? Yes.
And he wouldn't be standing in a future presidential election. The one person who has the power to persuade him that is in his and his country's best interest is President Putin, and I hope that at some point in this process he'll decide to do that.
After this disaster, is there any evidence at all the Russians are spending more time focused attacking ISIL themselves rather than other enemies of Assad?
No, that's the problem. We've got a fundamental difference of view. The Russians believe that the way to deal with ISIL is first of all to strengthen the regime and then allow the regime to finish off ISIL. We believe that so long as the Assad is still there, the opposition in Syria is going to be primarily focused on the Assad regime. You're never going to get the opposition and the regime working together unless an exit for Assad has been guaranteed, so that we know he's going at a certain point in time.
So that's the crux of any talks, but those are going to happen.
Next Saturday.
Meanwhile, when it comes to this country, are plans for a vote in the House of Commons to allow the RAF to target ISIL inside Syria, are they now off the table?
No, not at all. We're in exactly the same place, despite the story that ran earlier last week. We're in exactly the same place that we've been for months. When we think that it's right to do so, and when we're confident that there's a consensus in the House of Commons, we will go to the House of Commons and hold a debate.
With respect, there's never going to be a consensus. The question is, have you got enough Labour MPs to back you to make you pretty sure you can get that vote through?
Look, we are in a slightly different situation now. The Labour Party is a different organisation to that we faced that which we faced before the summer. We need to understand where the Labour Party is on this. At the moment, even its leader doesn't always agree with its policies. So there's a sort of exploration process here of understanding whether a majority of Labour MPs would in fact back this action. The way we've always worked in this country, with one notable exception, the 2013 vote on Syria strike.
Same subject, yes.
The way we've always worked, apart from that, for hundreds of years, is that when it's a question of putting British troops into military action, putting themselves in danger, we have always sought to work with a cross-party consensus. And whether we've been in government or in opposition, that has always been the Tory party's approach. And it's until 2013 was always the Labour Party's approach. And I hope we can get back to that position, that on the really big issues,
as soon as you think we have enough
consensus.
Labour votes to do this, you will do it.
When we think it is the right thing to do and we have a consensus in the House of Commons
Correct.
to get a majority, we will go back to Parliament.
All right, let me move on to another subject entirely.
Yeah.
Again, on papers, all over the papers, is the Prime Minister's much tougher sounding words about being prepared to lead Britain out of Europe if he doesn't get what he wants. Now, this week we're supposed to see the letter going to Donald Tusk, which sets out the government's objectives. Can I ask, have you seen those objectives?
I've seen the draft of the letter. We've been working on it, yes.
Marvellous. Will it include some detail? Because people are very, very interested in the detailed things that we're asking for, above all this 4-year ban on in-work benefits for migrants coming in from the rest of the EU to this country.
Well, what it'll do is, and it's what we were asked to do. We were asked by the President of the Council specifically to write the letter in this format, drawing together our arguments and our asks. We've set them out before, we've set them out in speeches, in articles, but we have never yet
And this is
collated
specific
them.
and crunchy, is it?
We've never yet collated them into a single document which sets out what it is Britain is seeking to change, why we are seeking that change, and to set out some parameters for that change. What it doesn't do, and what it won't do at this stage, is set out detailed, specific legislative changes. That's for the negotiation. In many cases, there will be more than one way of delivering the change that Britain wants to see, and it'll be for a discussion with our neighbours in Europe about how best to do it.
So we won't see details of, for instance, the in-work benefit proposals?
Well, you will see us setting out a clear marker for what it is we need to achieve, what it is we have to get to. Now, there could be different ways of doing that, combinations of use of domestic legislation and European legislation, changes to treaties or other ways of delivering legislative change. We don't want to be excessively prescriptive at the beginning of a discussion, because this letter is not the end of the process, it's the beginning of the process.
But in domestic terms, this particular issue has made headlines since 2014.
Yes.
It's been something that was talked about a lot during the election campaign, before the election campaign, and again after the election campaign.
Yes.
And lots of people are focusing on this as the sort of acid test as to whether the Prime Minister gets what he wants. So can I ask you whether you accept, as a lot of MPs seem to think now, that the proposal for a 4-year ban on in-work benefits would actually be illegal under EU law?
Under current EU law, it may not comply, but that's why why we are. Well, we're looking for changes, and some of the changes we're looking for will require changes to the body of law, the treaties, and the EU secondary legislation that are currently in place. We wouldn't be having to have a complex renegotiation if we didn't require substantial changes in the law that governs the EU.
But you know this country well. Do you accept that if you don't get big changes to stop the inward flow of EU workers, you will not be able to win a referendum?
What I have said repeatedly, and it's not just migration, there are several areas where we have to get substantive, irreversible, legally binding change in order to satisfy the British people. The British people will not be fobbed off with a set of cosmetic alterations to the way the EU works. This is about fundamental change in the direction of travel of the European Union to make sure that it works for Britain and that it is an effective organisation for all the citizens of Europe, driving our prosperity and our competitiveness in the 21st century. And if we can't do that, then we won't be able to win a referendum.
And if you don't see fundamental, serious, irreversible change of the kind you've been talking about, Prime Minister's made clear that he would not be in favour of staying inside the EU. Is that also your view?
Well, what the Prime Minister said, and I completely agree with this language, is if our partners snub us, if they turn a deaf ear to the very reasonable demands of the British people, demands that are in fact in the interests of all the people of the European Union, then we will have to think again about how to protect Britain's interest in the future. We're all clear that Britain gains significant economic benefits from being in the European Union, but the European Union has serious problems that need fixing. And we have, during this process, we have to get those things fixed.
And is there a perfectly tolerable life for this country outside the EU if this doesn't work?
Well, there would be big challenges for Britain outside the European Union, because many of our important trade and investment partners around the world see us primarily as a very user-friendly gateway into the European Union. If you talk to Americans or Chinese or Arab investors, they understand London, they like working through Britain, they understand our legal system, but we are an entry point for them to the EU. If we weren't in the EU, we would have to find a different way of promoting our economy. It's not impossible,
so it's not
but
impossible,
it would be challenging.
Okay. Now, you sit in Cabinet, you know all your colleagues very well. Is it really the case that things are so bad between the Chancellor and Ian Duncan Smith that we are on the verge of a Cabinet resignation?
I don't think so.
You don't think that Ian Duncan Smith is angry about attempts to go for universal credit to make up for the...
Look, we all have robust discussions with the Chancellor. That's the nature of the way government works. The role the Treasury exercises means that inevitably we have tough discussions.
He very rarely comes with good news.
Well, look, the Chancellor has a really tough job to do, but the headline commitment that we made to the British people in the general election earlier this year was to get Britain out of deficit and into surplus. That underpins everything else that we're doing, and our ability to deliver a better health service, better education, a better quality of life for people in this country, and we have to deliver on that.
Is Cabinet and advisor level kind of solidarity on that particular issue sufficient at the moment? Because we're getting a lot of briefings from a lot of very, very angry people at the moment.
Well, look, of course people fight their corner, and of course people seek to sway the agenda in one way or another. But I think every single one of my Cabinet colleagues would agree that the number one task in front of us is eliminating the deficit and getting Britain's economy on an even keel for the future.
Mr. Hammond, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I'll leave you to go to the Cenotaph now.